All right, let's go. Number 10. Kashta of Kush. Around 760 BCE, a king from the heart of sub-Saharan Africa marched his armies northward, extended his reach into the sacred city of Thebes, and quietly seized control of Upper Egypt without a single major battle recorded against him. His name was Kashta, and if you have never heard it, that absence is not an accident. Kashta ruled the kingdom of Kush, centered in what is now northern Sudan, at a time when Egypt was fractured and vulnerable, torn apart by rival Libyan dynasties squabbling over a civilization they could barely hold together. Into that chaos, Kashta moved with precision, but he installed his daughter Amenirtis as the divine adoratrix of Amun in Thebes, a position of extraordinary religious and political power, effectively embedding Kushite authority inside Egypt's own sacred institutions without firing an arrow. The evidence for his reign is astonishing in its scarcity. A single stele at Elephantine bears his cartouche. Scarabs inscribed with his name have been recovered, and yet Manetho, the ancient Egyptian historian whose king lists shaped how we understand thousands of years of pharaonic history, omits Kashta almost entirely. The man who initiated the process that led to Egypt's 25th dynasty, a dynasty that would rule the Nile Valley for nearly a century, barely registers in the official record. Modern Egyptologists now recognize Kashta as the architect of Kushite power in Egypt. His son Piye completed the conquest and received the glory. His other son Shabaka founded the dynasty and received the crown. Kashta built the foundation that made both of those achievements possible, and history gave him almost nothing in return. The erasure of Kashta is not an ancient mystery waiting to be solved. It is a choice that was made, repeated, and institutionalized across centuries of scholarship. His stele survives. His name is carved in stone. It is only in our history books that Kashta does not exist. Number 9. Tomyris, Queen of the Massagetae. In 530 BCE, a nomadic queen commanding cavalry armies across the steppes of Central Asia defeated and killed Cyrus the Great. The founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the man who had conquered Babylon, subdued Lydia, and built what was then the largest empire on earth. Her name was Tomyris, and almost no one teaches her name today. Cyrus had seemed unstoppable. For 20 years he had expanded his empire from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, defeating every force placed before him. When he turned his attention northeast to the Massagetae, a fierce confederation of nomadic Iranian tribes living in the region of modern Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, he first attempted diplomacy. He sent ambassadors to Tomyris, a widow who had inherited the kingdom's leadership, with a marriage proposal. She saw through it immediately. Her kingdom was what he wanted, not her. She refused. What followed, as recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus in his histories, was a campaign of extraordinary brutality on both sides. Cyrus used a deliberate trap, an abandoned camp stocked with wine, a substance the Massagetae had never encountered, to capture Tomyris' son and much of her army. Her son died in captivity. Tomyris sent Cyrus a final warning, one of the most chilling messages preserved from the ancient world. He ignored it. In the battle that followed, the Persian army was annihilated. Cyrus himself was killed. Herodotus records that Tomyris had his severed head submerged in a vessel of blood, fulfilling the warning she had sent him. The Achaemenid successors, Cambyses II, Darius I, the empire Cyrus had built, recorded almost none of this. An empire constructed on the mythology of Cyrus's invincibility could not survive the acknowledgement that a woman had ended him. The erasure was not grief, it was political necessity. If a queen could defeat the greatest conqueror of the ancient world, Why does every child learn Cyrus's name and almost none learn hers? Number 8. Liu He, the emperor who ruled for 27 days. In the summer of 74 BCE, a 19-year-old Chinese prince was summoned to the imperial capital of Chang'an to inherit the throne of the Han dynasty following the sudden death of Emperor Zhao, who had died without an heir. His name was Liu He, grandson of the legendary Emperor Wu. He would become emperor. He would remain emperor for exactly 27 days, and then, with meticulous precision, the most powerful official in China set about erasing him from the record. Liu He was selected by Huo Guang, the Grand Regent who effectively controlled the Han court. What Huo Guang wanted was a young emperor he could manage. What he got instead was a prince who arrived with 200 of his own officials from his home kingdom of Chang'e and immediately began acting like a man who intended to actually rule. Within days it was clear that Liu He had no intention of being a puppet. Huo Guang made his decision. The articles of impeachment that Huo Guang presented to Empress Dowager Shangguan listed more than 1,100 specific offenses committed by Liu He during his 27 days on the throne. The charges ranged from laughing during a mourning period to inappropriate appointments. Modern historians examining this document see it for what it is: not a record of misconduct, but a political assassination conducted with ink. Liu He was stripped of his title and exiled to the remote marquisate of Haihun in what is now Jiangxi province. He died there in 59 BCE at 33 years old, obscure and forgotten, his name absent from the official dynastic record. Then, in the spring of 2011, a tomb-robbing tip led archaeologists to an extraordinary discovery in the fields outside Nanchang. Excavations over 5 years revealed the resting place of Liu He, one of the richest Han tombs ever found, containing more than 10,000 artifacts including gold, lacquerware, bronze ritual vessels, bamboo texts, and what may be the earliest known portrait of Confucius ever recovered. What does it mean that the most contemptible emperor in Han history was buried like a god? His tomb survived 2,000 years underground. What else did Huo Guang's archivists fail to destroy? Number 7. Pepi II Neferkare, the pharaoh who outlived his own civilization. According to traditional accounts preserved in ancient king lists, Pepi II of Egypt's 6th dynasty may have reigned for approximately 94 years, the longest reign of any monarch in recorded history. He came to power as a child of around 6 years old, inherited one of the greatest civilizations on earth, and lived long enough to watch it collapse entirely around him. His successors buried that collapse so thoroughly that the final decades of his reign were effectively deleted from the story Egypt chose to tell about itself. Pepi II ruled during the Old Kingdom, the era of pyramid builders, of pharaonic power so absolute that provincial governors were little more than administrators serving the divine will of the king. That centralized order had endured for centuries. But by the later decades of Pepi II's reign, however long it actually lasted, and some modern scholars now argue for a considerably shorter period, the provincial governors known as nomarchs had become effectively independent warlords. The authority of the pharaoh had been quietly hollowed out year by year, grant by grant, until the institution itself was an empty title. The collapse that followed his death was catastrophic. Egypt fragmented into the chaotic period historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of famine, civil war, and administrative breakdown that lasted more than a century. Ancient Egyptian literary texts from this era describe scenes of shocking social inversion: the poor wearing fine linen, the noble starving, the rivers running red. Whether connected to Pepi II's reign specifically or not, the tone is one of a civilization in free fall. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom who eventually restored order faced a choice. They could acknowledge that Egypt's greatest institution had shattered under a single reign, or they could rewrite the narrative. They chose the latter. The official record jumped from Old Kingdom glory to their own restoration, papering over the Sixth Dynasty's disintegration as if it were an embarrassing footnote rather than a century of catastrophe. He may have ruled longer than any king in history. He is remembered, if at all, as the man who lost everything, and even that memory nearly didn't survive. Number 6. Akhenaten, the pharaoh his own successors tried to unmake. Around 1353 BCE, a newly crowned pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty made a series of decisions so radical, so disruptive to the foundations of Egyptian civilization, that within a generation of his death, his own court would attempt one of the most systematic and comprehensive acts of historical erasure ever attempted by any government in the ancient world. They called him, in the texts that survived, the criminal of Akhenaten. They chiseled his name from every wall. They smashed his face from every statue. For more than 3,000 years, he simply did not exist. His birth name was Amenhotep IV. Early in his reign, he changed it to Akhenaten, effective for Aten, and moved Egypt's capital to a brand new city he had built from nothing in the desert of Middle Egypt, a city called Akhenaten, known today as Amarna. He closed the temples of Amun, the most powerful religious institution in Egypt, redirected their enormous revenues, and declared that the Aten, the sun disk, was the only god. In doing so, he dismantled an entire theological order that had sustained Egyptian society for millennia and made a permanent enemy of the most powerful priestly class in the known world. The reversal began almost immediately after his death, likely around 1336 BCE. His successor Tutankhamun, almost certainly his son or son-in-law, began restoring the old temples. The pharaohs Ai and Horemheb accelerated the process. Horemheb ordered Akhenaten's name removed from the official king list and his monuments demolished. The stones of his great temples were broken apart and used as rubble fill inside the pylons and walls of later construction. These blocks, called talatat by modern Egyptologists, were rediscovered in the 20th century, Akhenaten's carved reliefs still intact on their hidden faces, preserved by the very act that was meant to erase them. The erasure was so complete that European Egyptologists working in the 19th century did not know that Akhenaten had ever existed. The entire Amarna period, roughly 20 years of Egyptian history, was a blank in the official record for over 3,000 years. Some scholars today argue that Akhenaten's radical monotheism planted seeds that eventually grew into the world's great Abrahamic religions, a claim that remains fiercely debated. What is not debated is this: for 3 millennia, it almost worked. If one of the most transformative rulers in Egyptian history could be completely erased for 3,000 years, what other figures have been buried so thoroughly that we have not yet found them? Fact number 5. Hamilcar Barca, the architect Rome refused to remember. In the spring of 241 BCE, a Carthaginian general negotiated the surrender terms of the First Punic War from a position of personal military undefeation. His name was Hamilcar Barca. His armies had never been broken in Sicily. His tactics had never been outmatched in the field. And yet Carthage's navy had been destroyed, and the war was lost around him through no failure of his own command. He accepted the terms, withdrew his forces with honor, and began planning what he would do next. Rome would spend the following decades learning, too slowly, why that should have terrified them. Hamilcar Barca, whose surname means lightning in the Punic language, was born around 275 BCE and belonged to the ruling class of Carthage. at the great North African commercial empire that was Rome's primary rival for dominance of the Western Mediterranean. What separated him from other Carthaginian commanders was a quality Rome's generals recognized and feared. He was not merely a soldier, but a strategic architect. After the First Punic War ended in 241 BCE, Hamilcar spent years crushing an enormous mercenary revolt that nearly destroyed Carthage from within, then turned his attention to Hispania. Beginning in 237 BCE, he led a methodical conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, building a military and economic empire in Spain that would fund and equip the campaigns of his sons for a generation. He died in 228 BCE at a river crossing in Spain, covering his army's retreat, a death that matched the ruthless clarity of the life that preceded it. His son Hannibal inherited everything he had built and nearly used it to bring Rome to its knees. The Romans spent decades terrified of Hannibal. They wrote endlessly about Hannibal. They studied Hannibal's tactics for centuries. But Hamilcar, the man who created Hannibal, who designed the strategic framework that made the Second Punic War possible, was allowed to recede. Here is the darkest part of this erasure. Virtually everything we know about Hamilcar Barca was written by Romans. Carthage's own archives, its histories, its records of the men who built and defended it were destroyed when Rome razed the city to the ground in 146 BCE. Every word Carthage ever said about itself was burned. The victor's version is the only version that survived. Rome burned Carthage to the ground and salted the earth. Every word we know about Hamilcar Barca was written by the civilization that destroyed his. Number 4. Nzinga Mbande, the queen who fought Europe to a standstill. In 1622, a Mbundu noblewoman from the kingdom of Ndongo in west-central Africa attended peace negotiations in Luanda with the Portuguese governor João Correia de Sousa. When she arrived and found that no chair had been provided for her, a deliberate insult designed to establish that she would stand before a seated European official, she had one of her attendants kneel on hands and knees and used him as her seat. It was the opening move in one of the most extraordinary political careers in the history of African resistance to European colonialism. Her name was Nzinga Mbande, and for most of the world's history classrooms, she has never existed. Nzinga became queen of Ndongo in 1624, in what is now Angola, following the death of her brother, King Ngola Mbande, under circumstances that remain disputed. She inherited a kingdom already under military pressure from Portuguese colonial expansion, which was relentlessly pushing inland in pursuit of territory and enslaved people for the Atlantic trade. What followed was not a desperate last stand, but a calculated decades-long strategic campaign. She reorganized her court, absorbed refugees from Portuguese aggression into her military, established alliances, and when necessary, fought pitched battles against one of Europe's most aggressive colonial powers. Between 1641 and 1648, she allied formally with the Dutch West India Company against the Portuguese, in coordinating military operations that modern historians describe as sophisticated guerrilla warfare of a quality that her European enemies consistently underestimated. The Portuguese attempted assassination, religious delegitimization, and military conquest in succession. None of it worked. She countered each move with one of her own, retreating when necessary to the kingdom of Matamba, which she captured and ruled, and continuing the resistance from there. She died in 1663 at approximately 80 years old, still ruling, still negotiating from strength, outlasting most of the men who had tried to destroy her. For Portuguese colonial records, the primary archive available to later historians, systematically diminished her military achievements and reframed her story as one of occasional colorful resistance rather than sustained strategic brilliance. The erasure was not oversight. Colonial administration had every institutional reason to ensure that posterity did not understand how completely one African queen had refused to be conquered. She fought Europe's most aggressive colonial power for 30 years and died undefeated in her own kingdom. Why did it take until the 21st century for her story to appear in mainstream history books? Number 3. Subutai, the general who nearly conquered the world. In the winter of 1241, a Mongol general stood in the ruins of Hungary and began drawing up plans to invade the Holy Roman Empire. His armies had just destroyed the combined military forces of Poland and Hungary within 2 days of each other. 2 separate battles fought roughly 300 miles apart, coordinated with a precision of timing that no European commander of the era could have matched, and that no military force on Earth would replicate until the 20th century. His name was Subutai. He is almost entirely unknown, and he came within a single death from completing the conquest of Europe. Subutai was born around 1175, the son of a blacksmith in the steppes of what is now Mongolia. He entered the service of Genghis Khan as a young man and rose to become the primary military architect of the Mongol Empire's expansion. He personally directed more than 20 campaigns across a theater, stretching from China to the gates of Vienna. Modern military historians estimate he won more than 60 pitched battles, a record unmatched in the ancient world. The Secret History of the Mongols, one of the few primary Mongol sources to survive, names him among Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders. Military historians, including B.H. Littlehart, have placed him alongside Napoleon and Alexander the Great as one of the supreme strategists of all recorded warfare. The 1241 invasion of Europe was his masterpiece. He divided his forces into 3 coordinated army groups operating across hundreds of miles, feeding false intelligence to European commanders, manipulating their responses, and destroying their armies one by one before they could combine against him. At the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241, Mongol forces annihilated an army of Polish and Teutonic knights. At the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, just 2 days later, Subutai destroyed the Hungarian royal army, killed 2 archbishops and 3 bishops, and left King Bela IV fleeing to Croatia. Hungary ceased to function as a military power. The Mongols were already moving west toward Vienna when word arrived that the great Khan Ogadai had died in Mongolia. Every prince of the blood was required to return east for the succession. Subutai's recall left the Mongol armies without their strategist. Europe was saved not by any army, not by any castle, not by any act of Christian resistance, but by a succession crisis 1,000 miles away. He came within a campaign season of conquering Europe. The only thing that stopped him was a death in Mongolia, and we don't even teach his name. Number 2, Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who was chiseled out of history. Around 1458 BCE, one of ancient Egypt's most successful pharaohs died after a reign of approximately 21 years. She had expanded Egypt's trade networks, built one of the most magnificent temples in the ancient world, and governed a civilization of millions with such stability that her era is remembered by Egyptologists as a period of extraordinary prosperity. Within 2 decades of her death, someone initiated one of the most deliberate, methodical, and thorough acts of historical erasure ever executed by a state apparatus in the ancient world. Her name was Hatshepsut, and for roughly 3,500 years she was gone. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and the widow of Thutmose II, both pharaohs of Egypt's 18th dynasty. When Thutmose II died, and his young son Thutmose III was too young to rule alone, Hatshepsut served initially as regent. Then she did something unprecedented. She assumed full pharaonic titles, wore the double crown, adopted the ceremonial false beard and declared herself not regent but pharaoh, a king of Egypt in every legal and religious sense the ancient world recognized. Under her direction, her architect Senenmut designed the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a terraced masterpiece carved into the cliffs of the Theban hills that modern architects still study. She dispatched a trade expedition to the distant land of Punt, recording its wonders in extraordinary painted reliefs that still survive on those temple walls. Then Thutmose III took sole power after her death, and the erasure began. Her statues were smashed, hundreds of them, their faces methodically destroyed, and the broken pieces buried in pits at Deir el-Bahri. Her cartouches were chiseled from walls across the empire, from temple pylons to administrative records. The places where her image had stood were either left blank or filled with the name of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III himself, as if the 21-year reign between them had never occurred. The motivation remains debated: personal revenge by Thutmose III, a desire to restore unbroken male succession, a political need to remove a female ruler from the official king list. Whatever drove it, the execution was staggering in its thoroughness. European Egyptologists working in the 19th century encountered her defaced monuments and assumed the inscriptions referred to a man. The scale of the erasure was so complete that it generated its own confusion for 2,000 years of subsequent inquiry. Then, in 2007, a team led by Egyptian antiquities chief Zahi Hawass used CT scanning and DNA analysis to examine an unidentified mummy recovered from tomb Khufu 60 in the Valley of the Kings, first excavated by Howard Carter in 1903, and matched a loose molar from a wooden box bearing Hatshepsut's cartouche to a gap in the mummy's jaw. The identification, accepted by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, confirmed that the most powerful woman in ancient Egypt had been lying unrecognized on the floor of an unmarked tomb for more than 3,000 years. She ruled one of the world's greatest civilizations for 21 years, built monuments that still stand today. It was erased so completely that it took a dental X-ray in the 21st century to confirm she had ever held power. The terrifying truth is not the erasure itself. It is the certainty that Hatshepsut was not the only one. Number 1. Qin Shi Huang and the night he tried to burn the past. In 213 BCE, in the 34th year of his reign, the first emperor of a unified China sat in his palace at Xianyang and listened to his chancellor Li Si deliver an argument that would echo across every authoritarian state that followed him for the next 2,000 years. Li Si's proposal was simple, chilling, and unprecedented in its ambition. Destroy every book that did not serve the state and execute every scholar who remembered what the books had said. Qin Shi Huang approved it the same day. Qin Shi Huang, born in 259 BCE as Ying Jing, a prince of Qin, had unified the 7 warring states of China in 221 BCE after decades of brutal military conquest, becoming the first emperor of a single Chinese state and adopting a new title that translated roughly as First Emperor for all eternity. His achievements were genuinely staggering. He standardized weights, measures, axle widths, and the written script across a civilization of tens of millions. He began the construction of what would become the Great Wall. He designed a tomb complex guarded by an army of approximately 8,000 terracotta soldiers, each with individually sculpted features. Whatever else he was, Qin Shi Huang was a man of extraordinary systematic vision. That same systematic vision was what made the book burning so catastrophic. Chancellor Li Si's edict, preserved in Simi Qin's records of the Grand Historian, written roughly a century later during the Han Dynasty, specified that all texts except those dealing with agriculture, medicine, divination, and the history of the Qin state itself were to be surrendered to authorities for burning. Private possession of the classic of poetry or the classic of history was punishable by death. Any scholar who used the past to criticize the present would have his entire family executed. The following year, according to Sima Qian, more than 460 scholars were buried alive in the capital city of Xianyang. Modern historians debate whether buried alive is literal or a metaphor for execution, and whether the Han authors of Sima Qian's era exaggerated the story to discredit their predecessor dynasty. What is not seriously debated is that Qin Shi Huang and Li Si destroyed an enormous portion of China's pre-unification intellectual heritage, and that they did so deliberately, systematically, and with the full machinery of an imperial state behind them. The supreme irony of Qin Shi Huang's legacy is one that he never anticipated and could not have survived knowing. His own dynasty collapsed just 4 years after his death in 210 BCE, swept away by the very social forces his brutality had generated. The Han dynasty that replaced him immediately set scholars to work reconstructing what had been destroyed. Confucian texts were painstakingly recovered from hiding places, tucked inside walls, memorized in fragments by old men who had outlived the purge. Recovered versions of the classics became the subject of bitter academic disputes about authenticity that lasted centuries. And every word we know about Qin Shi Huang, every detail of his tyranny, his ambition, and his unprecedented campaign against human memory, was written by the intellectual descendants of the scholars he tried to destroy. He targeted the very mechanism by which human beings remember. He did not erase a person or a dynasty or a civilization. He attempted to erase the past itself, to sever humanity from its own history and replace it with a single state-approved version of events. And in doing so, he wrote the blueprint that every book-burning government, every archive-destroying regime, every history-rewriting autocrat from his era to ours has followed without acknowledgement and without shame. The frightening part is not that he tried. It is that for centuries it worked, and we still do not know exactly what he destroyed. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.